More than a schedule, transitioning to a hybrid existence. Maribel is the founder of Lopez Research and the Data for Betterment Foundation. Lopez Research is a market research and strategy consulting firm covering topics that range from artificial intelligence to hybrid work transformation. Her clients range from startups to global firms, including 10 of the Fortune 30. Maribel is also the author of the John Wiley and Sons book, Right Time Experiences, a contributor to Forbes, and host of the podcast Reimagine Hybrid Work. She's also the founder of the nonprofit, the Data for Betterment Foundation, that helps individuals and businesses understand how to prepare for new roles as companies embrace the new future of work technologies. Joining her in conversation, we have Hunter Canning, who is passionate about bringing people together to foster growth, kindness, and a true understanding of each other. Take it away, Hunter. Thank you both for being here today.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you, Maribel. So wonderful to have you here. Thank you for making the time. How are you today?
Hey, Hunter, thanks for having me. I'm great, but apparently I need to write a shorter bio. That just took a long time to read.
No, you know what? You know what? I had a copy editor on the fly there, and she just did me a solid. They just did me a solid because my bio is long. My bio is long, and Mariella was like, "We got stuff to talk about, so don't you worry." It's so funny that you mentioned that because I'm like, I'm going to send a shorter version so that we can get to talking faster. And I think we're just going to do that version, what just happened live today.
Perfect.
So, I'd love to hear a little bit, we heard a bit about your bio there. Can you tell me a bit about, just give me a little context about your career journey? How did you get to this point that you're at now? And then we'll jump into some of the questions.
Yeah, I guess the first thing I would say is that career journeys aren't linear. They don't necessarily start where you think they're going to start. I mean, I started my career in accounting, and now I'm working with enterprise leaders on how to build a better future of work. I mean, it just couldn't seem farther from where I began. So,
yeah. So let's talk about what we're talking about today with the summit is hybrid work, right? These hybrid work environments, we're all kind of figuring it out. I think we've come a long way over the past couple years. I think there's still a lot of room to grow. So I'd love to hear about some of those ways that we can grow. So what are some of the key considerations that let's talk about the organizations, because of course, like I can change my home office to be better, but let's talk in my work-life balance, which I am so interested in always talking about. But what are the considerations that organizations need to make when transitioning from this hybrid work? Because there's a lot of old guard. I feel like there's still some companies that are like, nope, you're coming in. And that's the way it is because that's the way we know how to do it. So what do they got to do?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. The first thing you have to do is decide whether or not that actually is going to be your culture. And some organizations clearly have decided that's not going to be their culture. I personally think that is limiting for them in the long run, but that's the way they decided to do it. We've seen this happen a lot in financial services and some of the regulated industries. But okay, let's just say that you've decided that yes, you want to do this, and there's full-time remote, there's full-time in the office, and then there's this hybrid distributed work thing that we're talking about now. And I think most organizations are struggling with the fact that they have those three personas that they have to deal with. So the first thing you have to do is rethink your culture, because all of culture that we've had up until this point was really based on the fact that most of the people were going to be in the organization. Whether we said that or not, or whether we said we had flexible work, we really didn't. And this past 2 years has proven that. And that means that you have to be very intentional about making sure that your employees aren't treated like second-class citizens if they're not in the building. So they need to have the same access to technology. There needs to be a sense that when you're planning, you're not just planning for the people that would be in the room, but also for the people that would be in a remote collaboration tool, as an example. You have to start with creating flexibility and recognizing not everybody wants the same things. So I think some people over-indexed one way or the other. Some people said, okay, everybody wants to work remote. We're going to shut all of our offices and give them like WeWork credits. And that might be a bridge too far for some people that really do want to come into a specific office with their company and have that kind of engagement. And the other way is you have to come all into the office. So recognizing that some people want to show up a few days a week, some people want to be full-time remote. There's options there that you have to think about. And then that means you have to establish who gets to decide. Is that decided by the individual? Is that decided by the group manager? Is that decided by the company? And this is the one element that I think is really very hotly debated about how that should happen. People are very specific. No, it's got to be company-wide. And other people like should be team, and other people like screw it. It's really about the individual. So I just would say that's the first thing. So if you want, I can keep going on some other things that I've seen people struggle with.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about that. I mean, I feel like, a struggle. First off, before we move forward, I do appreciate what you're talking about is that there isn't one way to do it, right? Is that it's individual, it's team, it's company wide. And so all can be true, but it's about figuring out what's right for each company, what's right for each team, what's right for each individual, and how do they do that? Do they experiment? Do they try one and go? What's the best way if you're just getting into it, how do you figure that out?
If you're just getting into it, I think there's a voice of the employee discussion that you have to have, right? Really like ask. Because right now, I think many organizations are just dealing with assumptions. So we assume everybody wants A or we assume everybody wants B. Well, let's figure out like what percentage want A or B and then try to move forward from that. I think that as an organization at the top level, people do have to make a call on this, but I do think that they need more information. So that's the first thing. So assuming you have some sense of it, and maybe it's like 20% want to be remote full-time or 20% want to be in the office full-time, that gives you the opportunity to make some decisions about how much office space, where should the office space be, things of that nature that are really important on a financial level. The real big shift with this move to hybrid distributed work, which is super hard for companies, is that we actually didn't train managers to begin with. So now we really have to have people managers. People are going to really be managing people. People are everywhere. And there's a second big transition that goes with that is we're moving from the concepts of saying, okay, I'm measuring your value by time of butt in seat to I have an outcome that I want to measure. There's a specific job that needs to be done in a specific time. And as long as you do that, it doesn't matter if you do it at 2 a.m., 4 a.m., 4 p.m. If it happens, that's fine. And a lot of managers are struggling with that flexible concept. Like, how do I deal with that flexibility? Because if you really want this to work, you have to take into account that people don't have the same schedules. They might be caregivers, they might have children, they might just be more productive at certain hours of the day. Whatever it is, you have to be able to be flexible to that. So that's a big change. And then I think in the last session you were talking, that I heard a little bit of, you were talking about well-being. Well-being is essential because people that have worked at home, we've seen the overwork happen. And so we have to figure out, how do we balance that? How do we make sure that they're still having a life, that they're stepping away enough so that they can be fresh and come back to it and do it well? So that's something as a manager, I don't think we took responsibility before, but now it's part of what we have to think about when we're building these hybrid distributed models. And then proximity bias is the other one I want to speak about. There has actually been research that was done that say that many managers have not been promoting remote people in the past because they were remote and they just, if they saw somebody, they were more top of mind. So we have to really get rid of that proximity bias as an issue as well.
Yeah, so I feel like there's maybe a relation in way to mine this information, right? So so there's the proximity bias, and then there's also, I think it was Google a long time ago, we smashed the clock, and now we've like globally have smashed the clock. We're working all at different hours, different time zones. I'm a night owl, you're a morning person. All this stuff is happening. So from the manager's point of view, how do they measure this, and how do they check their own biases, right? Because if I'm not like seeing you in your cubicle and you look like you're working, and a lot of times, some people are not, now we're not doing that anyway. So how do we, do they respond to their emails, or their numbers are good, their deliverables? Like, I'm sure it depends on the field, but like, how can we as a work community start to agree on some ground rules and some new normals?
Yeah, and I do think that the ground rules will be very different depending on what company it is. So I think you need sort of a company-wide set of ground rules just to have it not be chaos. We'll probably have some generally accepted things that happen, like it will at some point be generally accepted that you will have remote positions, as an example. One of the things I do think has to happen is it's that flip in metrics that I was talking about. And that's a top down thing. So people have to get more specific about saying, okay, here are the goals that we're trying to achieve, our key KPIs, right? And then the managers have to figure out, okay, what are the projects that are associated with that? And then who's going to do that work, right? I know this sounds very basic, but honestly, what you find happens is things aren't that structured. They really aren't. But then the onus, I think, is on the manager to make sure that they communicate how they expect to be dealt with. Do they expect you to answer an email at 10 o'clock at night or not, right? There's that kind of thing, right? So there's probably generally accepted hours for when you communicate. There's generally accepted principles around you have to log when you are and aren't available so people know when they can count on you, right? And there has to be a arrangement, I think, between the manager and a team. I think it can be very difficult to do this at a company-wide level. And let me tell you why. I think the roles can be extremely different. Some roles require you to be in a certain place at a certain time. If you are fielding customer calls from 9 to 1, that's your job. You got to be fielding customer calls from 9 to 1. Whereas if you're doing software development, perhaps that software development happens at midnight, perhaps that software development happens at 2 p.m. And it's really more about when that project is done. So you have to kind of categorize your projects, figure out if there's a certain time boundary around it, and then have that discussion with the employees to make it happen.
Yeah, and I think that's really valuable information, and it's prompting some questions from the chat here on this topic. Jennifer asks, so I have an influential person in the office who thinks that everyone should be at the exact same schedule under the exact same work conditions related to whether it's remote, hybrid work, no consideration given to responsibilities, duties of each position or department. How do I combat that? So let me just add on to this a little bit to clarify, to open it up a little bit. So this could be, this influential person might be their boss. I don't know. Or maybe this is someone that is below them. So I think those are two different conversations. And maybe you can speak to how do we change people's minds around this? And maybe if it's your boss that's enforcing this and you want to say something.
Yeah, so I think this gets into a discussion around, is there any, third party information that you can bring to the table? Because if it's an influential person, it's your opinion versus their opinion, right? And that's not going to be very helpful in an argument because the influential person will win. So the way you combat that is you combat that with examples of things that are happening at other companies. So let me give you an example of this. No meeting days. So there's a couple of high profile companies that are doing no meeting days. There's been research at MIT about like the benefit of no meeting days if it's say 1 day a week versus 2 days a week, right? So you can bring some of that to the table. Some of that exists out in the landscape. And that would be the first way that I would do that. And the second way is to say, okay, I hear you, and let's see if we did the opposite of that. What do we think would happen? And just do some like scenario mapping around that to say, okay, what's the art of the possible of this versus the art of the possible of that? And sometimes what happens is the person that you're talking to, it's not so much that they're fully married to the idea, it's just that they think it'll really work and they haven't heard a good set of data points as to why anything else would make sense. So you're trying to expose somebody else to new ideas. Now, this may or may not work. I mean, I understand people are people. Sometimes they do get very, hunkered in. But I think part of the challenge is it can't just be like an I said versus you said. You have to try to bring some examples to the table of who's doing what. Like you just talked about Google, right? So the interesting thing about Google is they morph things over time, right? If you look at, say, Facebook Meta was like, hey, you can work anywhere, right? If you look at Google, they're doing well, it's going to be 3 days back to the office. So they're going to have a real challenge of trying to figure out, well, what 3 days are those? Is that 3 days by group? Is it 3 days by the company in general? But you can see that there are going to be different ways of doing it. And you can see if you wanted to try to convince somebody of another narrative that there are examples out there to do that. And this just isn't a tech thing. Let me step back for a second. So I was looking at one example of a company that they're in manufacturing. And they were struggling with retention. And one of the things they decided to do was they were very specific about what the goals were in manufacturing. And they did hey, if you work 3 days and you meet these goals during that time, then you get the fourth day paid, but don't have to show up, right? So there's all kinds of interesting experiments. Unilever is another great example. Unilever said, hey, we understand that maybe not everybody that is qualified as a candidate can work a full year because maybe they have childcare duty they have to do at certain times. We're going to allow, say, a 6-month employee and give them full-time benefits because that's a big deal for them, right? So there are cases where you can say, here's something that's different. Let's take a look at that and see if that would apply to our organization.
I also am curious about, you were talking about retention and also maybe so in this transition into hybrid and both, maybe some people are leaving because they're feeling a little lost in the weeds. They're not feeling connected to their employees, to their boss. How do we create engagement that maybe people are actually looking forward to, as opposed to like, oh, I gotta do this company donut thing or whatever, like how do we make it fun? And maybe the donuts, they're fun too, but like how do we keep that engagement? How do we stay creative with it? And so it doesn't just become another obligation, but actually is useful.
Yeah. So personally, I missed the opportunity to eat a pastry that I didn't buy that I would have felt too guilty to buy on my own. So I missed the donut day. But okay, taking that aside for a second, I think what you're really getting at is like, how do we create culture in a distributed world, right? Yeah. And that is a key challenge. And I'm going to say that really, in general, we haven't nailed it yet. But I do think that this water cooler thing was real. People did have sort of impromptu meetings. People did have a chance to go sit down and have lunch with friends. That doesn't happen when you're in a distributed environment. So one of the things that's interesting about that is some of that human connection does happen. So some people, for example, I was speaking with one company and they decided to close all their offices and send people home. They decided to give the people that wanted to that wanted to be in an office environment a WeWork so that they could see somebody if they wanted to, or just be out of their house. But then they took some of the money that they were saving with real estate and other things and said, we're going to do a quarterly offsite where everybody comes together and gets to meet each other and we do bonding activities. Now, that doesn't necessarily work if you're a huge company. If you've got 150,000 people and you're going to try to bring them all to, Cabo for a weekend, that's probably not going to work. but it can work on a team level. The other thing is you do have to make time for the blowing off steam. And while that might sound, it might sound like it's not productive, it's really important to have those times where it's like we get together and I'm going to send you a Grubhub coupon if you're not in the building or whatever is convenient for that area, so that we can all sit down, we can have some Zoom time. Not that we want more Zoom time per se, but it is a time for us to get to know each other, and I think we need that get to know each other. Some people send out the silly socks. I mean, corporate branded socks are a big deal. And then you've got, the social media challenge of like, hey, let's do all sorts of cool things on Instagram with our cool socks. Like, where did you take your cool socks, right? So there are fun things that we can do that sort of build that concept of community without everybody being in there. But you do have to be very directed about it. It doesn't happen organically. I think when you're onboarding people, you have to be very specific about making sure that You team them up with a buddy, somebody that, can help them through processes so that they don't feel left out and alone. I think it's important to maybe build cross-functional mentoring, because you need to have people that will mentor you and advocate for you. And there are other things I think might be important as well, like business coaching. So I happen to do for my own personal self Better Up, and I know a lot of companies do that, but it's another way to kind of provide a benefit to the employee, help them figure out how they might navigate through some of the challenges of trying to be distributed and grow their career or engage with other people. And then having time to actually having the equivalent of office hours where people can just drop in on Slack or whatever and like chat with you and say, hey, I've got this problem, right? Because you have to be available for people at least part of the time so that they can build a relationship with you as a manager if that's one of the things you're trying to do.
We have a question from Aaron in the chat, and I love this because this is coming from an employer. I feel like we talk a lot about employees and being in the state of mind of an employee. And so Aaron asks, there just seems to be this overall sense of employee entitlement regarding ground rules, expectations, and communications with the consideration of the Great Resignation culture. How do we get employees to understand that hybrid has to work for both the individual and the company?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think part of it is connecting back to your why as a company. So what are your customers asking you for? And therefore, if your customers are asking for certain things, this requires a certain amount of time for you to be in the office. This requires a certain diligence about when things get done. It's not that employers are trying to say no to things. It's that there's a balance around it that I think we're struggling with. It went from seeming that there was nothing that we gave employees to now employees want everything. And part of this is just where we are in the generations that people actually want to have better life balance. So I think there's some recalibration on behalf of the companies about what better life balance might look like. And I think a lot of that is, hey, we're going to give you time. We're going to give you a certain type of benefits, but there are ground rules that are associated with that. And you have to actually also be willing to let some people go. So what I think is important around this is one of the things that we're struggling with is that I talk to a lot of business users that want to attract new talent as an employer. And I think we need to do a little more investment in some of the existing talent that's there to grow them into new roles, because they already know you, they already know your culture, and there's a lot of good left in that. For example, one of the things that I think a lot of people struggle in the diversity and inclusion sector is ageism as well. Nobody ever talks about ageism. There's a lot of people that could be retrained if we actually spent the time to do it. And then I think there's when you're hiring, matching people to, how do I put this? Sometimes I feel like it's a popularity contest, but I also sometimes feel that we don't do a good enough job of explaining what the real role is, because we're so excited to try to get somebody in. And then when they come in, there's a mixed match between what the person thought they were signing up for and what they actually signed up for. So it's not an easy answer. There is I'm going to acknowledge there is a tremendous amount of entitled behavior that is going on. Some of that will change a little over time as the individuals we're looking at have gone through a few jobs and just kind of get a sense of what it is like. Some of it's about the clarity on our side. And some of it's also about making sure that we're really balanced and saying, hey, I'm not expecting you to answer the emails at 10 o'clock at night. We do have specific hours. It's not like you work all the time, but there are expected times for you to do things. This is the contract.
Absolutely. One of my favorite things that I've really embraced over the past year is the send later feature, where I'll write an email at night. Yeah, isn't it the best? All different email clients do it. I think you can do it right in Gmail Workplace now. And I'll write up something in an odd hour, and I'll send it to 10 a.m., 8 a.m., whatever it is. local time to the person that I want to land it with, or whatever time works for them. And that's one automated thing that I think has been really great. But can you talk to me, I'm still taking some initiative there. That's really just like a snooze button. Can you talk to me more about like what AI things are out there now and that support this work hybrid workplace? Like what's available to us, and maybe where are we going with this stuff?
Yeah, well, AI is a really big topic, but I will say, just to close out on your automation with the schedule send, I think this is a great example of, if you send it at 10 o'clock at night, somebody will probably respond to it. So not sending it at 10 o'clock, sending it at 8 a.m., even though you thought of it at 10 o'clock, like you're thinking of it, you just want to get it off your plate, right? But they don't need to deal with it until 8 a.m. So I think that schedule feature is actually really important. And it's part of automation. So AI is interesting because there's light AI and there's heavier AI, right? So AI is a journey within any company, and there's lots of ways that you can use AI. So let me give you a couple examples. So if you're just looking at the basic collaboration, it comes with a lot of AI built into it. So it can come in with suggestions of who you should be collaborating with. It has transcription now that happens, right? It has noise cancellation features. All of that is technically AI, right? So that's happening with AI, but we don't think of it as
Three
AI.
of those things are happening right now. I got a noise canceling headphone on. There's transcription happening for this. It's all happening right in this moment.
Yeah, and that's good, because I think that's AI that is, out of the way, not necessarily dead square into what you're thinking about. One of the things a lot of organizations are struggling with is the customer care aspect, right? They've seen tremendous volume in customer care calls. And so the concept of building digital bots, both for your employees and for your customers, to answer questions is actually a wonderful use of AI. And I know that a lot of people get bots, they really stink. They don't answer anything. Well, a lot of that's about how bounded you make it. It's, if you're trying to have a full-on human-like conversation, no, that doesn't work. If you're trying to do a password reset in IT, and somebody can go through a few simple clicks and have that sent, and that takes like something off of your internal IT security administrator's plate, that's great. It's the same for your customers. So I see a lot of opportunity in that use of AI for taking data that you already have, unlocking it in an interesting, easy way to get out to your employees and your customers. Another way that we're seeing companies look at AI is in workforce scheduling. And there's an easier variant of that and a more strategic, forward-looking variant of that. The easier variant of that is just looking at when there's typically been busy times and having the software figure out how many people that you're going to need where at what time. If you're in a fast food scenario, this is a great example of use of AI. How many people do you need for lunch versus how many people do you need at 3 p.m, and how do you balance the cost and other things? Then you might get into some more interesting things. Like if you're in the airline industry, there's a lot of use of AI of trying to figure out, like, how do we deal with weather delays? If we have weather information that we put into an AI model and it says that 3 days from now there's going to be massive storms in Texas, how do we make sure we have the right amount of planes and people in the right place to get everybody where they need to go? It's a more sophisticated use of AI. So, AI is here. It's living all around us. And, I think it has a lot of promise.
Absolutely. Well, Maribel, I'm afraid we're already out of time. It zipped by. Thank you so much for taking me through this, the ground floor of the human experience all the way to this artificial intelligence experience of how we're molding these worlds in this hybrid environment. So what's the best way our folks can connect with you? Is LinkedIn your preferred platform, other social media?
I'm on LinkedIn and I'm on Twitter. So I'm Maribel Lopez on LinkedIn, and I'm at Maribel Lopez on Twitter. So I hope to engage with you. And I also have Reimagine Hybrid Work podcast. Ciao.
Fantastic. Well, I got something to listen to on my next flight. I'll be downloading your podcast. Thanks very much. And thank you for making the time today. I really appreciate it.